The train screamed once through the frozen air, dragging a gust sharp enough to slice across the snow-packed ground. Ruth Carter pulled her worn shawl tighter around her neck, her fingers numb around the cracked handle of her suitcase. Each breath left her lips as pale smoke, vanishing into the cold. She stepped down from the carriage, her heel slipping slightly on the icy platform. Above her, a warped wooden sign leaned under frost, the letters barely legible. Wolf Pine Station. The town lay low in the valley, like a thin thread of smoke caught in winter's hold. Rows of wooden houses hunched under white roofs, chimneys coughing thin plumes into the gray sky. Ruth stood still, the weight of travel pressing on her shoulders. From her coat pocket, she drew a creased letter, paper yellowed, ink brown, the words slanted as though written in haste. "Come to me, Ruth. We'll begin again among the mountains and the wind." Signed, Elias Hartley. That promise had carried her more than 1,000 miles from St. Louis to this frozen corner of the West. She believed she would find a man waiting, a home, a beginning. But after a few cautious questions at the station, the truth fell like an axe. "Elias Hartley?" The station keeper gave a dry laugh, scratching his chin. "Married 3 weeks back. Blonde girl from the dress shop down the street. Whole town knows." Ruth didn't speak. The wind slipped down her collar, but she didn't move. She only nodded once, as if the gust itself had torn the last of her hope clean away. That afternoon, she walked through the main street. Eyes followed, curious, pitying, some amused. A black woman alone, carrying a scuffed suitcase and dignity wrapped tight as her shawl. Whispered words trailed her like smoke. When she reached the only inn in Wolf Pine, the Birch Inn, she stopped. The innkeeper, a stout older woman, looked Ruth over from hat to boots. Her voice was clipped. "No rooms left." Ruth steadied her breath. "I can pay. The woodshed will do." The woman didn't flinch. "No. This isn't a place for the kind that travels alone." The words hit heavier than the falling snow. Ruth bowed her head slightly, turned away without another word, and stepped back into the street. Snow thickened, clinging to her hair, her lashes, her trembling hands. Behind her, the window light dimmed until the inn vanished in a wash of white. She walked on, each step dragged like she carried the weight of her whole life. The wind howled through the alleyways, doors creaked, and lanterns swayed. Near the bend by the stables, she stopped to catch her breath. Then a sharp gust knocked her off balance. From the curtain of white mist, a tall figure emerged, leading a chestnut horse. The sudden nearness startled her. Her suitcase slipped, bursting open on the ice. Knitted scarf, a worn Bible, spools of thread, a pair of small scissors scattering across the ground. The man stooped to help. He was broad-shouldered, his coat dusted with snow, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. Only his eyes showed, clear, steady, edged with something like steel. He picked up her torn glove, mud crusted along its seam. For a long moment, they stood in silence. Between their breaths and the faint glow of a lantern down the street, something passed. Something wordless, unshaken by pity or curiosity. Just truth, plain and quiet. His voice came low and rough. "Where's your home?" Ruth looked down at her soaked shoes, then at the empty street. The answer caught in her throat before she managed a whisper. "I don't have one." The wind rose again, scattering snow across their boots. He waited, then gathered the last of her belongings, placed them back in the suitcase, snapped it shut, and handed it to her. "There's an old Hartley place north of town," he said, eyes still on her. "Walls are standing, better than the street." Then he turned, leading his horse through the storm, his footsteps heavy, fading into the white distance. Ruth watched until he disappeared. Her breath trembled, unsure if it was the cold or something else, something that had quietly stirred within her chest. She looked down at her glove, at the faint warmth still left from his hand. That night, Ruth walked toward the abandoned house, the one flicker of light in the dark valley ahead. The stranger's question echoed in her mind. "Where's your home?" She didn't have an answer. Not yet. But somewhere along that snow-covered road, she began the long journey to find it. Ruth walked nearly 2 miles along the empty road, each step cracking through the frozen crust beneath her boots. The lights of town dimmed behind her until nothing was left but the dark wall of pine trees and the wind whispering through their bare limbs. The suitcase on her shoulder grew heavier with every breath, but she kept walking, steady, slow, northward, just as the man had said. By the time she reached the cabin, night had swallowed the valley. The small wooden house stood half buried in snow, its roof sagging, windows broken, one side of the porch caved in. Ruth stopped at the gate and stared. This was the place Elias once described in his letter, a small home but warm enough to start again. She let out a faint laugh, not from bitterness, but from the quiet recognition of her own foolish hope. Inside, the air was damp with the scent of ash and rot. Snow had crept in across the floorboards, glittering under the moonlight that slipped through a gap in the roof. Ruth set her suitcase down and breathed warmth into her cupped hands. She dragged a broken chair toward the hearth, pulling from her pocket what was left of the burned letter. Only half the page remained, ink smeared beyond reading except for one line. "Don't fear the wind, for I'll always be there." She stared at those words a long while, then fed the paper to the weak flame in the hearth. It curled, glowed red, and turned to dust. The first fire in Wolf Pine was lit with the ashes of a promise. Ruth gathered scraps of wood from the corners of the cabin and coaxed the flame higher. She laid her shawl on the floor and sat near the fire, hands outstretched to its fragile warmth. The wind whistled through the cracked frame, making the shadows dance like frightened things. She leaned back against the wall, eyes half closed. The cold pricked her skin like tiny needles, yet none of it hurt, as much as the loneliness that had settled inside her. "Just one night," she told herself. "In the morning, I'll find work. I'll find a way to live." Outside, the snow began to fall heavier. She must have drifted off, because the sound of hooves jolted her awake, the heavy snort of a horse and the crunch of boots in the snow. The door creaked open, wind rushing in with the shape of a man. It was him, the stranger from earlier. Graham Thorne filled the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark coat dusted with snow. In one hand he carried a bundle of firewood, in the other a small oil lantern that cast a thin, golden light across his face. The light caught the hard lines of a man used to weathering storms. His eyes took in the cabin, the woman by the fire, the trembling of her shoulders. "No one lasts the winter in this place," he said, his voice low and rough. Ruth didn't look away. "I just need shelter until morning." He gave a slow nod, said nothing more, and knelt to feed more wood into the fire. The flames rose, warm and alive, brushing orange against the smoke-stained ceiling. Ruth held out her hands, feeling life return to her fingertips, as if some invisible thread had been reconnected. Graham set the lantern on the table. He studied her for a moment longer, then turned toward the door. "I'll come back in the morning," he said quietly. "If you're still here, I can help fix that window." Her voice came soft, almost a whisper. "Thank you." He paused at the threshold, the silence stretching between them, broken only by the crackle of burning wood. Then he stepped out into the storm, his figure fading into the snow until only the dim light of his lantern remained. Ruth watched it disappear. Inside, the fire glowed brighter, casting soft light over the cracked walls. For the first time since she'd arrived in Wolf Pine, she didn't feel completely alone. The warmth around her wasn't just from the fire. It was from the memory of someone choosing to return. As she lay down near the dying embers, the wind outside changed its sound. It no longer howled like emptiness. It breathed softly, like someone keeping watch in the dark. The first days in Wolf Pine passed like a stream of cold water, clear, silent, and unkind. Each morning, Ruth rose before the sun reached over the pines. Smoke drifted from the chimneys of town, gray and thin against the frozen air. From the cracked window of the old cabin, she watched people begin their day. Coats pulled high, hats low, their eyes dull but deliberate in one thing, never looking her way. Rumors in Wolf Pine traveled faster than wind. The town thrived on whispers. They called her the black woman left behind in the snow. Some said Elias Hartley had tricked her. Others claimed she'd come to steal another woman's husband. Whatever version was told, it was enough for anyone passing by to glance once, then turn away, as if even their gaze might soil them. Ruth kept walking through town each day. She needed work, needed food, needed a reason to stay upright. But every door she knocked on seemed to close a little harder. At Perkins's general store, she stood quietly before the counter, hands clasped tight. "I can sweep the floors or weigh the goods," she said softly, steadying her voice. Mr. Perkins hesitated, scratching his head. His eyes flicked away. "No need, miss. My daughter handles it just fine." Ruth gave a faint nod, thanked him, and stepped back into the cold. The door closed behind her, and a voice carried through the thin air, low but sharp enough to reach her. "Came all this way for a man, they say. Got left in the snow." A brief chuckle followed. She kept walking. Her shoulders trembled, but her pace never faltered. Wolf Pine was too small to hide in, yet Ruth chose the middle of the road, head high, steps steady, as if to say she would not disappear. Near the end of town, she stopped at the bakery. The clerk slid a sack of flour across the counter without a word. It was heavy, nearly half her weight. Ruth bent down, gripping the strap tight, her fingers shaking as she tried to lift it. Then came a voice, deep and even. "Let me." She turned. Graham stood there, wrapped in a dark coat, his gloved hands steady, his expression calm, as if what he offered was nothing at all. "It's fine," she murmured, still trying to lift. "Let me," he repeated. Without waiting for her to argue, he bent and lifted the sack easily, the muscles in his arms flexing under the coat. Their fingers brushed for a brief second, just a touch, but warm enough to feel like sunlight in winter. Ruth drew back, startled, while Graham slung the bag over his shoulder and started down the road. Ruth followed quietly, their footsteps crunching in the snow. The only sound between them was the steady rhythm of their breath mixing in the cold air. When they reached the cabin, he set the sack beside the hearth, dusted his hands, and spoke as if to himself. "You'll want to fix the fence. Wild animals come close this time of year." "You don't have to help me," she said softly. "Don't have to," he replied, short and plain. "But I've got time." He left before she could thank him. After that day, Ruth began to see him often. He came without warning, never stayed long. Sometimes he brought dry wood. Sometimes he simply stood outside, checking if the wind slipped through the cracks. Once she woke in the night and saw a shadow moving by the fence, hammering stakes into the ground. She knew it was him, but she didn't call out. People noticed. They always did. "Thorne's been helping that colored woman?" a voice whispered in the church pews. "Strange. He hasn't spoken to anyone since his wife passed." The whispers grew like smoke, clinging to doors, to eyes. But Ruth stopped caring. When Graham came by, she greeted him with a quiet nod, her eyes calm, almost warm. One afternoon, when he set another bundle of wood at her door, Ruth said softly, "You don't have to bring more. I can cut it myself." He paused, looking at her. There was something in his eyes, half irritation, half understanding. "You don't have to do everything alone," he said, then turned away. Ruth watched his back fade into the trees. In her hands, she still held the last piece of wood he'd carried in, rough, cold, yet carrying the faint warmth of his touch. She placed it near the fire. The flame rose bright and steady, and in that glow, Ruth realized something simple and true. Kindness doesn't need to speak. It comes quietly, like that man, and stays just long enough for a frozen heart to start thawing. The fog lifted late that morning. The sun climbed slowly over the eastern ridge, spilling a pale light across the frost-covered fields. Ruth was mending the hem of her dress by the window when she heard the sound of hooves crunching outside. She looked up and saw him, Graham Thorne. He dismounted, his shoulders dusted with snow, his heavy boots creaking on the wooden steps. Ruth rose quickly, pulling her shawl close. A soft knock followed, and then his low, graveled voice. "Miss Carter, I need a favor." She opened the door. The cold swept in, carrying with it the scent of hay and wind. "Come in," she said. The cabin still looked plain, but now there was order to it. Firewood stacked neatly by the hearth, a scrap of cloth pinned across the window to stop the draft. The fire burning low but steady. Graham took it all in, nodding once, as if admitting she'd done the impossible, turned a ruin into a home. He pulled off his gloves and drew a folded piece of dark cloth from his coat. "I've got a few hands up at the ranch. Their work shirts are falling apart. I heard you can sew." Ruth took the fabric, her smile soft. "I can try." "I'll pay you fair," he said, voice firm, the kind of fairness that came naturally to men who didn't like to owe anyone. "You don't have to pay much," she replied. "I just need work." His eyes lingered on her for a moment, cool, thoughtful. "Not everyone in Wolf Pine is willing to hire a stranger. You know that." "I'm used to being one," she said quietly. He didn't answer, just set the rest of the cloth on the table. "If you need measurements, I'll send the men down." "That won't be necessary," Ruth said. "I can use your shirt as a guide. You're likely about their size." She realized too late she'd looked at him longer than she meant to. Graham raised an eyebrow, then shrugged off his coat and pulled a chair closer. "Then let's do it right." Something shifted in the air, something almost tender. Ruth stepped nearer, measuring tape in hand. She drew it across his shoulder, down the curve of his sleeve. When the cloth brushed his arm, she could feel the warmth beneath, steady and alive. Graham didn't move. His gaze followed her hands, his expression unreadable. The silence between them deepened. Only the soft slide of the measuring tape and the even rhythm of their breathing filled the room. Ruth broke it gently. "You work that ranch alone?" "Not entirely," he said. "A few men come through during the season. But the house, it's just you." He nodded, eyes drifting to the falling snow beyond the window. "I'm used to that." She hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever feel lonely?" He was quiet a long time before answering. "Loneliness is easy," he said finally. "Trusting someone again, that's the hard part." Their eyes met. The light from the hearth flickered, painting the walls in a soft amber glow. For a fleeting moment, the distance between them, the widower and the woman left behind, seemed to dissolve. They stood there, bound by something unspoken, fragile but real. He was the one to break it. "You ever lived alone before?" Ruth gave a small, wistful smile. "Never, but I'm learning." He studied her face, then nodded once as if that answer made sense to him. Rising, he slipped his coat back on and fastened the buttons slowly. "When you finish the shirts, bring them to the ranch, or I'll send someone down." She followed him to the door. "Thank you for trusting me," she said. He turned, and for the first time his eyes softened. "I don't trust easy," he said, "but you're not like the rest." Then he stepped outside, and the gust of wind that followed stirred the firelight. Ruth stood watching his figure fade into the pale horizon, the scent of winter and wood smoke lingering in his wake. She sat back down, laying the dark fabric across her lap. The needle trembled in her hand before finding its rhythm. Outside, snow fell in slow, quiet drifts. Inside, with each careful stitch, she felt something steady forming. Not just a seam, but a connection, thin as thread, strong enough to hold two lonely hearts together. Morning in Wolf Pine was different that day. The sky was still the same shade of ash, the pines still heavy with frost, but the air buzzed with whispers moving like wildfire through dry brush. "Elias Hartley's back." Everyone said it, their words sharpened by curiosity and the thrill of gossip. Ruth heard it at the bakery. She was folding loaves into a paper bag when the shopkeeper said, almost casually, "He came in this morning. Brought his new wife with him. Pretty thing, blonde hair, red dress. They walked right down Main Street, turned every head in town." Ruth didn't answer. She just nodded once and tightened her grip on the paper until her knuckles blanched. The name, once a promise, once a dream, carried across miles of dust, cut through her like a dull knife. She walked home slowly, her head bowed. The thawing snow turned the road to mud, each step dragging as if the past itself clung to her boots. Near the diner by the church, she heard laughter, then a voice she could have recognized in her sleep. "Ruth Carter, I'll be damned. You're still here." She froze. Inside, Elias sat among a group of men, his new coat spotless, his grin wide. Beside him, the blonde in the red dress smiled faintly, her gaze cool and assessing. Their eyes turned toward Ruth as if she were some small amusement. She might have walked on, but he raised his voice, loud enough for the room to hear. "I figured you'd have gone back to St. Louis by now. Or maybe still waiting for someone desperate enough to marry you." The laughter that followed was dry and thin as broken glass. Ruth turned toward him, standing straight. Her eyes no longer shimmered with pain. only with something sharp, like light off steel. "You're right," she said quietly, her voice even. "No one's come for me, but I stopped waiting a long time ago." The silence that followed was brief, uneasy. Then she turned and walked away, her back straight, her steps sure. At the far end of the diner, Graham Thorne sat unmoving, his coffee gone cold. He had seen everything. His face didn't change, but his fingers whitened around the handle of his cup. When Ruth stepped outside, her shawl slipped from her shoulders and fell to the floor. Graham stood, crossed the room, and picked it up. The faint scent of soap and smoke lingered. He folded it neatly, laid it on the counter, and left without a word. By afternoon, the sky had turned the color of pewter. Ruth reached the cabin at dusk. The fire wouldn't catch. Her hands shook so hard, she dropped the flint 3 times before the spark finally held. The small flame flickered weakly, its warmth thin as breath. She sat down against the wall, hands pressed to her knees, and let the stillness close in. His voice echoed faintly in her head. The stares, the laughter, the pity, they all came rushing back. But no tears came this time. She would not give the world that satisfaction again. When night fell, she stepped outside. The air was clear, the wind gone still. Moonlight spilled across the snow, turning everything silver and silent. She breathed in deep, the cold biting her lungs, and whispered, "It's all right." The words were not for anyone else. They were a vow to herself. From the distance came the faint glow of a lantern. Graham, riding toward the ranch. She knew his silhouette now, the straight back, the slow, certain rhythm of his horse. He didn't stop, only tilted his head slightly as he passed. A silent greeting. On her porch, something waited. Her shawl folded carefully, edges straight. Beside it, a small note written in firm, deliberate strokes. "Keep warm. The night's turning colder." Ruth sat down on the step, the shawl in her hands. His touch lingered in the fabric, steady, real, and kind. She closed her eyes, her breath leaving her chest in a long, trembling sigh. For the first time since arriving in Wolf Pine, she wept. Not from hurt, but from knowing she had survived it. The wind whispered through the pines again, gentle now. The light from her window spilled across the snow, soft as a promise. And there, alone beneath the winter sky, Ruth sat quietly, no longer fighting her solitude, but holding it like a space wide enough to hear her own heart, and to know that, whatever storms might come, she would not break. That evening, the sky thickened into the color of wet ash. Heavy clouds pressed low over the northern pines, smothering the last light of day. No one in town dared step outside. The wind howled like a starving beast. Ruth fastened the shutters, stuffed cloth into the cracks, but the door still rattled each time the wind struck. Night fell faster than she could light another fire. The only glow in the cabin came from a wavering oil lamp, its yellow flame shuddering across the walls. Outside, snow lashed the windows in hard, white bursts. Then came a sound that didn't belong to the storm, the snort of a horse, boots on the porch, the groan of hinges giving way. The wind burst in first, then the man who had walked through every storm she'd known since coming to Wolf Pine. Graham stepped inside, his coat soaked through, snow dusting his hair and shoulders. He carried a bright lamp in one hand, a bundle of wool blankets in the other. His breath came in short, frosted clouds. Setting the lamp down, he looked at her. "The storm will last all night," he said, voice rough with cold. I saw your light flickering and thought you'd gone to Hilda's. Ruth shook her head. I didn't want to trouble anyone. Better that than getting buried in snow. He dropped the blankets, crouched by the hearth, and added wood to the weak flame. The fire leapt higher, casting its glow across both their faces. The room began to breathe again. Ruth stood near the stove, rubbing warmth into her palms, while Graham settled into a chair, peeling off his worn gloves. The firelight caught the scars, his wrist, the hard calluses of his palms. She noticed, but said nothing. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that felt less like distance, more like understanding. Then Ruth spoke softly. You're not afraid to be seen here? People will talk again. Graham kept his eyes on the fire. People talk about everything. Then they forget. She smiled faintly. Do you always speak so little? Only when more words wouldn't help. And now? He turned toward her. Maybe now's different. Their gazes met. The storm outside faded to a hum. Ruth sat down across from him. When I came to Wolf Pine, I thought I'd lost everything. Then someone knocked on my door in the dead of night and brought firewood. I haven't forgotten that. He looked down, almost uneasy. I only did what anyone should do. No one else did. Only you. The words hung in the air. Firelight brushed her cheek, painting her eyes a soft amber. Ruth placed her hands near the flames. The warmth crept slowly into her fingers. Graham watched her quietly, seeing not the fragility people whispered about, but the quiet strength of someone who had refused to vanish. Have you ever lost someone? She asked at last. He hesitated, then nodded. My wife, 7 years ago, first winter at the ranch. She fell sick before spring came. I buried her up on the hill, under the pine that never loses its needles. Since then, I stopped believing in spring. Ruth didn't speak. She simply laid her hand on his arm, light, steady, a wordless sharing of grief. Her skin was warm against his, and for a moment neither of them breathed. Do you still miss her? Yes, he said, but not the same way. How's it different? He met her eyes. His voice was low, raw. Now I just remember that once I was loved. Something inside Ruth stirred, sharp and tender all at once. She drew back slightly, but his hand caught hers, not tight, just enough to ask her to stay. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the fire crackled brighter, throwing long shadows on the walls. The space between them slowly disappeared. I thought I knew love once, Ruth whispered. But some people only want to be needed. They never plan to stay. He didn't answer. Their eyes met again, still, steady. The wind howled, but here there was only the hush of breath, the rhythm of two hearts finding the same pace. Graham reached up, brushed a strand of hair from her face. Slowly, carefully, as if afraid to break something fragile. Ruth lifted her head, her eyes luminous in the firelight. When their lips met, it wasn't hurried or hungry. It was quiet, inevitable. A confession made without words. The kiss was brief, gentle, true. When they parted, the fire still burned, the forest still roared, but inside the small cabin, the storm had finally gone still. When Ruth opened her eyes, pale gold light had slipped through the cracked window, glinting off the floor, where last night's fire had died to ash. Outside, the sky was clearer than she'd seen in weeks. The storm had moved on, leaving a fine blanket of snow across the roofs, so still that she could hear the faint whisper of wind threading through the pines. She stayed there for a while, feeling the warmth that lingered in the room. Not from the blankets, but from the air itself, heavy with the scent of smoke and old wool. Near the hearth, Graham sat in the wooden chair, a cup of black coffee in hand, the morning sun cutting across half his face. When he noticed she was awake, he simply nodded. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Ruth rose quietly, adjusted her shawl, and moved to the stove. The kettle was light in her hands, the sound of water filling it louder than the silence between them. On the chair beside the fire lay Graham's torn jacket, the shoulder frayed to the size of a hand. She fetched her sewing kit, sat down, and began to mend it. Each stitch moved slow and steady, as if she were repairing something larger than fabric. Graham watched her for a moment, then stood and went to the door. The hinges still trembled from the storm. He picked up a hammer and a strip of leftover wood, kneeling to brace the frame. When Ruth stepped outside, he was already at work, shirt sleeves rolled up, arms bronzed and solid against the snow. "I thought you'd be heading back to the ranch this morning," she said softly. "I will," he answered, not looking up. "But your door won't stand another wind like that." "I thought I could fix it myself." "You could," he said, voice calm, sure. "But not everything's meant to be done alone." She said nothing more, only stood beside him, listening to the clean rhythm of his hammer, the sharp sound mingling with the first birds returning after the storm. For a moment, peace felt like something real, simple, earned, and alive. When he finished, she handed him the jacket, neatly folded. "It's done. Try it on, see if it fits." He took it, their hands brushing. Neither pulled away. His gaze met hers, deep, quiet, like still water with depth unseen. "Thank you," he said. "For the jacket?" "For that. And other things." No one asked what other things meant. He stepped outside, mounted his horse. Ruth stood on the porch, watching as his figure blurred into the pale distance. The emptiness she used to carry didn't come back. In its place was something lighter, like a thread, newly tied, delicate yet strong. That afternoon, Ruth walked into town for supplies. The sun had softened the snow, and the streets were lined with muddy tracks. As she crossed the square, whispers drifted around her. A few women near the church leaned close, voices sharp and sweet. She stayed the night with Graham Thorne. "I heard he brought her blankets in the storm. Do you really think that's all he brought?" Ruth heard every word. Each one landed, but none sank. She didn't bow her head this time. She kept walking, shoulders straight, eyes forward, as if their words were nothing more than wind skimming past. A shopkeeper stepped in her path, lips curved in a knowing smile. "Miss Carter, I hear you make fine clothes for Mr. Thorne. I suppose that's one way to keep a customer loyal?" Ruth stopped. Her gaze was calm, steady enough to still the air between them. "I keep my customers with my work," she said quietly, "not with what people choose to imagine." She passed by and the murmurs faded behind her. For the first time, the noise of the town felt small, smaller than her steps, smaller than her breath. When she reached home, the repaired door was firm beneath her hand. The fence had been reinforced too, new planks nailed in place. On the porch lay a small bundle of firewood and a folded note. In strong, slanted writing, it read, "The door's fine now, but if you need anything, I'm close." Ruth smiled faintly, tucked the note inside the drawer with her thread and needles. Outside, the snow had begun to melt. The sun sank low, pouring a soft amber glow across the room. She stood by the window, watching the thin line of smoke drift from the chimney, curling upward into the clear sky. Inside her, something had settled, quiet, steady. The town could talk, the wind could turn, but for the first time, Ruth knew this with certainty. She was no longer the one left behind. That morning, the sky over Wolf Pine was unusually clear. The fog lifted early, revealing the main road glazed with a thin shimmer of snow that sparkled under the sun. Ruth was on the porch, hanging freshly washed cloths to dry. The red threads fluttered gently in the breeze. No one came to warn her. There was only the sound of hooves stopping in front of the house, and then a voice she had once believed she would never have to hear again. "Ruth." She turned, her hand still gripping the edge of the fabric. Elias Hartley sat astride his horse, dressed in a brown coat and a white silk scarf. Time had barely marked him. Only his eyes were changed, still proud, but dulled by a hint of weariness. Ruth didn't move. Morning light caught her cheekbones, the golden hue of her sun-darkened skin sharp against the snow. "What are you doing here?" He dismounted, taking a few steps toward her, his tone cautious. "They told me you were still in Wolf Pine. I had to come, to apologize." She gave a short, humorless laugh. "Apologize? After all this time?" "Ruth, it wasn't what you think," he said quickly, running a hand through his hair. "I was forced to marry. My family needed the alliance with the Parkers. If not, we would have lost the ranch. But I never forgot you." The words fell flat, practiced, like lines from a play rehearsed too long. Ruth looked at him with a stillness that chilled more than anger ever could. "You remember me, yet you married another woman. That's your kind of remembering?" Elias exhaled sharply and took another step forward. "I made mistakes. I just want to make things right. I can take you away from here, Ruth, somewhere new, where no one knows what happened. I've got land, money. I can take care of you." She said nothing. The wind lifted a loose strand of her hair. Her eyes stayed fixed on him, not hateful, just hollow, as though she were listening to a story that no longer belonged to her life. "You think I need someone to take care of me?" Elias hesitated, words faltering. Before he could speak, another voice came from behind her, low and steady. "I think you should leave." They both turned. Graham stood at the fence line, one hand resting on the post, his gaze calm but unyielding. He didn't come closer. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to shift the air. Elias forced a thin smile. "Mr. Thorne, I'm not here to cause trouble, just to talk." "You're already trouble," Graham said evenly. "You've done enough of that to her." Ruth lifted a hand slightly, stopping him from coming any closer. "Let him finish. I want to hear what he calls making things right." Elias straightened his shoulders. "I'm offering her a second chance, a proper life, not here where people treat her like she doesn't belong." Ruth's voice was quiet, but every word struck clean. "A chance? I already have one. I built it myself." His jaw tightened, whether from shame or anger, she couldn't tell. "You'd stay here with him? On that broken-down ranch? You deserve more. Graham's fingers curled around the fence rail, his expression unreadable. But before he could answer, Ruth spoke again, slow, deliberate, every syllable steady as a blade. "I don't need saving anymore, Elias. Not from you. Not from anyone." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to stop. Elias stood there, pale under the sun, his mouth half open and empty of words. After a moment, he turned, climbed back onto his horse, and rode away without another glance. When the sound of hooves faded, only the smell of wood smoke and pine sap lingered. Graham remained by the fence, watching the road long after it cleared. Ruth turned toward him. "Are you angry that I let him speak?" He shook his head. "No. Just angry that he ever made you believe you were small." She smiled faintly, a quiet, wistful smile. "I did believe it once, but not anymore." He studied her for a long moment, his expression softening into something almost reverent, as if he were witnessing a truth larger than either of them. By late afternoon, the light turned gold across the snow. Ruth stood by the doorway, watching the sun stretch long shadows across the field. The wind carried the clean scent of pine resin and the promise of thaw. She knew the world would always hold storms, and men like Elias who brought them. But inside her now was something that weather could not touch, the calm certainty of a woman who no longer lived as anyone's victim. By late afternoon, the sky over Wolf Pine had turned the color of tarnished copper. Wind blew hard from the west, carrying with it a strange, scorched smell. Inside her sewing workshop, Ruth was gathering scraps of fabric when a shout broke the rhythm of her hands. "Fire! Fire at the end of the row!" She ran to the door and froze. It was her workshop, her first real foothold in town, built stitch by stitch from every coin she'd saved. Flames clawed at the dry wooden roof, red light flashing through the windows like a signal she couldn't outrun. She pushed through the growing crowd. "There's someone inside," she cried, but no one moved closer. The smoke was already thick, the wind spitting embers across the street. Someone caught her arm, but she wrenched free and plunged into the haze. Heat slammed into her like needles. Her throat closed, coughing out the name of the girl who sometimes helped her. "Hazel!" No answer. Eyes stinging, she groped through the dark, the smell of burning cloth and oil flooding her lungs. Then a hand, strong, firm, clamped on her shoulder and dragged her back. A voice she knew even through the roar. "Ruth! Out!" She turned. Graham stood there, bareheaded, his coat thrown over one arm, his face streaked with soot. Before she could speak, he swung the coat over her head and pulled her toward the door. "She's not in there. I saw her run." She wanted to ask how he knew, but her throat burned too badly. He shoved her out into the cold air and turned back. "There's a barrel of oil by the stove." "Don't!" she managed to shout, but he was already gone, swallowed by the smoke. A minute later, the ground shook with an explosion, a sound like the sky breaking open. People screamed and scattered. Ruth fell to her knees, the street a blur of ash and sparks. She looked up just in time to see the roof collapse, flames bursting out in a rush of black smoke. "Graham!" She lurched forward, but two men grabbed her arms, holding her back. "Stay back!" someone yelled. "Someone's coming!" Through the rolling smoke, a figure appeared, stumbling. Graham, sleeve scorched, smoke rising from his arm, clutched a small wooden chest, the one where Ruth kept her savings and the fine fabrics she'd hoarded like a dream. He dropped it at the edge of the street, coughing, eyes shut against the sting. Ruth tore herself free and ran to him. She knelt in the snow, her hands trembling as she touched his burned arm. "God, you're hurt." He opened his eyes and managed a faint, crooked smile. "Told you. Never keep oil near the stove." Her eyes blurred. Anger and gratitude rose together, but she said nothing, only grabbed the nearest clean cloth and wrapped his arm, careful, slow, as if one wrong move might make him vanish. Around them the crowd began to disperse, voices dimming into the wind. The workshop had burned to a black frame, flames dying to embers. All that remained was the two of them kneeling on a street dusted with ash and snow. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered, voice ragged. "And you?" he said softly, eyes steady despite the pain. "I couldn't stand there and watch." They fell silent. She held his arm, feeling the pulse still beating under scorched skin. A tear slipped from her eye and dropped onto his hand, darkening the gray soot. "Does it hurt?" "Less than you think." She lifted her head. Their eyes met, smoke around them, light flickering from the last flames. The world narrowed to a single quiet point. Words no longer belonged here. Graham raised his uninjured hand, brushing soot from her cheek, a gesture so gentle it cut through the ruin like a blade of clear water. In that touch, the noise fell away. There were no whispers, no onlookers, only a woman clinging to the arm of the man who had walked through fire to carry out the one thing of hers he could still save. Ruth looked around at what remained: charred beams, floating ash. Everything she owned had become smoke. Yet in that moment, she understood she had not lost everything, because he was still here. That morning, the town of Wolf Pine seemed to hold its breath. Rumors spread like brush fire. Elias Hartley had returned, and this time he wasn't here to apologize. He was drunk, shouting in the square, boasting about the woman who used to be his and the man who stole her. Each word dripped like poison, seeping through doorways, finding its way into every ear. Graham Thorne said nothing. He simply led his horse down Main Street, stopping when he saw Elias standing in the middle of the road, his coat whipping in the wind. The townsfolk backed away, forming a silent ring. Elias turned, his smile twisting under the noon light. "Well, look who's here. The hero of Ruth Carter," he said, voice rough with liquor. "Bet you're proud, aren't you? Pulling her out of the fire like some kind of saint." Graham dismounted. He wore no hat, no gun. His expression was calm, colder than the first wind of spring. "You done talking?" Elias sneered. "Just speaking the truth. She was mine once. I've got every right to talk about her." Graham stepped forward, slow, deliberate, each stride landing like a nail into the ground. When he stopped just a few paces away, his voice carried, low, steady, cutting through the murmurs. "A real man doesn't keep anything by chains." The words dropped heavy as iron. No one moved. Elias opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His face tightened. His eyes darted around, searching for someone to agree, but no one met his gaze. People turned away. Graham didn't move closer. He didn't need to. "If you'd ever loved her," he said quietly, "you wouldn't have made her afraid." A gust swept through the square, scattering ash and the cigarette from Elias's hand. He looked down, jaw twitching. "She'll leave you too," he muttered hoarsely. "They all do." Graham said nothing. He turned, took his horse by the reins, and walked away. And that silence, the calm, unbending weight of it, was what broke Elias more than any blow. He left town before dawn the next day. By noon, Ruth reopened her workshop. The old sign, burned in the fire, was gone. In its place hung a simple piece of white cloth, hand-stitched in black thread, where hands create new beginnings. The door swung open, sunlight spilling across the floorboards. Ruth laid out her fabric rolls, sharpened her scissors, and smoothed the table with a slow, sure motion. Women began to arrive. Faces she knew, faces that had once turned away. No one spoke at first. They just came in, sat quietly, and asked to learn a few stitches. Ruth taught them patiently, her voice calm, even. The room filled with the sound of thread sliding through cloth, of quiet breathing and shared purpose. It wasn't just sewing she passed on. It was something deeper, the steady rhythm of dignity returning to one's own hands. When afternoon light poured through the windows, Ruth wiped her palms and looked around the room. On the wall hung Graham's jacket, the one she had mended during a still winter night. It stayed there, a silent testament that gentleness could be a kind of strength. Outside, Graham leaned against the fence, arms folded, hat low over his brow. He didn't enter. He only lifted his hat slightly, a wordless greeting. Ruth smiled, a small, grounded smile, and that was enough. He knew she was all right. Soon, the people of Wolf Pine stopped calling it the shop of the abandoned woman. They began to call it something simpler, truer, the women's house. That evening, Ruth sat by the lamp, stitching the last hem of the day. Through the window, she saw Graham's silhouette still there, quiet as the dusk itself. She didn't call to him. She didn't need to. Her fingers paused on the fabric. "No one keeps me with chains," she murmured, almost to herself. "But sometimes people stay because they choose to." The firelight glowed gold across the half-sewn cloth. Outside, a soft spring wind drifted through the pines, carrying the scent of resin and wood smoke. The sky deepened to violet, and for the first time in a long while, Wolf Pine felt warm again. That spring came early. The last shards of ice melted along the creek behind the hill, revealing water that glittered under the sun. Wolf Pine was busy preparing for the harvest fair, but what folks talked about most wasn't the crops. It was that strange wedding out by the edge of town. "She's got some nerve," one woman said, clutching a basket of eggs. "After all that trouble she stirred, now she's marrying Thorne? Openly?" "And he's just as mad," another replied. "Marrying a colored woman in front of everyone? Who do they think they are?" The gossip rode the wind, slipping through every porch and parlor. But in the small cabin by the trees, Ruth didn't hear, or perhaps she simply refused to listen. That morning, she stood before a wooden mirror, adjusting the white cloth veil she had sewn herself. It wasn't silk, no lace, just fine cotton trimmed with even, careful stitches. Every thread had been pulled through on long nights when the wind howled outside, a reminder that true joy never needed to be borrowed. Sunlight spilled across the porch, the scent of pine mixed with the sweetness of cut grass. From afar came the rhythm of hoofbeats. Graham Thorne, steady as always. The ceremony took place in the backyard. There was no church, no preacher, no music. Only a handful of friends. Hilda the baker, who had helped Ruth rebuild her workshop. Old Thomas from the ranch. And little Hazel, Ruth's first apprentice, clutching a bundle of wildflowers. Graham arrived simple as the morning. White shirt, brown coat, hair combed, eyes calm with a rare peace. When Ruth stepped out, the air itself seemed to still. It wasn't beauty that silenced them. It was the quiet certainty in her steps, as if each one declared that she had walked through fire and would never bow again. They stood facing each other beneath a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Hilda's voice, raspy but warm, broke the hush. No church is wide enough for two hearts that have known gratitude and grit. Let the sky bear witness. That's blessing enough. Graham smiled faintly and reached out his hand. Ruth placed hers in his, the same hand that had once burned, saving her from the fire, now healed, a pale scar tracing across the skin. She looked at it, then at him, and said softly, "We've both been burned, but we're still here." He squeezed her hand, "And we still choose to believe." No vows, no rings, just a nod, a look, and that was enough. When they turned, a few townsfolk stood at the fence, watching. Some pressed their lips tight, others looked away. Yet here and there a few heads dipped gently, a quiet, wordless acknowledgement. Hazel ran up, handing Ruth the bouquet. "You look so pretty," the girl whispered. Ruth smiled, brushing the child's hair. "We all do when we're finally ourselves." Laughter rippled across the yard, soft, genuine, and alive. As the sun sank low, Ruth and Graham sat together on the porch. The last light of day washed over the drying cloths fluttering in the wind, turning them into ribbons of gold. From far off, the murmur of the town still drifted, but here, it was only wind. Ruth leaned her head on his shoulder. "I never thought peace would come," she murmured. "Not because they accepted me, but because I stopped needing them to." Graham's reply was quiet, certain. "We weren't made to please the crowd, Ruth, just to be grateful for what's real." She looked toward the woods, where the last specks of sunlight flickered between the pines, and smiled. To the world, it was only a small wedding, no flowers, no procession, no choir. But to Ruth, it was a victory whispered in the language of the free. The day a woman once cast aside stood unshaken in the light, choosing her love and her life with her own hands. A year had passed since Ruth first arrived in Wolf Pine through a storm that almost buried the world. The town was no longer the cold, narrow place it used to be. Along the main street, wildflowers grew through cracks in old planks, and the laughter of children filled the air each morning, a sound once rare in this valley. The small house by the woods had changed too. The porch had been widened, the roof newly thatched, the yard alive with green grass and daisies. On the fence hung a wooden sign, the letters hand-painted by Ruth in soft white. Sewing and literacy class, for anyone ready to begin again. Each morning she opened the door and let the light spill into the warm scent of new timber. Children sat at the little tables, tracing their first letters in chalk. Beside them, women, widows, abandoned wives, or simply souls looking for a quiet corner, stitched pieces of fabric together, listening to the rhythm of the needles like a slow heartbeat of renewal. Ruth moved between the tables, adjusting a child's pencil grip, helping another woman cut a straighter line. Sometimes she paused by the window and saw Graham outside on the porch, bent over the fence, hammer in hand, shirt dusted with sawdust, hair falling over his brow. He was still the same quiet man she met that first winter. But now, when he looked up, he always smiled. At noon, when the class ended, Ruth tidied the room and joined him outside. They sat together on the porch steps, watching the sun drift across the hill. Sparrows hopped on the grass, then vanished into the light. "The grass grows faster than I thought," he said, lifting his cup of tea. "I used to think this ground was too dry for anything to take root." Ruth smiled, her gaze tracing the golden shimmer on the porch rail. "Everything grows if someone cares for it." They sat in silence, the kind of silence born from two people who had learned to speak through presence alone. Inside, the curtain swayed, and the smell of bread floated from the kitchen. It was all so simple that anyone seeing Ruth now, the woman who once trembled, lost in snow, would hardly believe she was the same. A little girl ran up with a piece of embroidered cloth. "Miss Ruth, I finished it." Ruth crouched down, examining the uneven stitches. "It's beautiful. You just need a little more patience next time." The child grinned and darted away. Graham watched, then said quietly, "You've done something no one here believed you could." Ruth shook her head. "I just lived." "They call it courage, but it's really just learning not to be afraid anymore." He rested his rough, warm hand over hers. "Fear's natural, Ruth. You just stopped letting it decide where to go." They stayed that way for a long while, as sunlight filtered through the trees, scattering golden flecks across her hair. Ruth looked up at the sky, once heavy and gray, now vast and blue. "I used to think," she said, softly, "that if I hadn't been betrayed, I'd still be safe. But maybe I'd never have known what freedom feels like." Graham didn't answer. He only held her hand tighter. The truth needed no reply. A sparrow landed on the railing, tilted its head at them, then flew off, leaving a few feathers drifting through the light. By dusk, Ruth gathered the sewing tools from the table. She looked around the porch, at the beams Graham had built, at the chair where she once mended his burnt coat. Everything looked the same, and yet everything had changed. Warm, steady, peaceful. As the sun slipped behind the trees, they sat side by side, hands entwined, gazing toward the forest. No vows, no papers, just breath, sunlight, and two people who had walked through ruin and chosen to stay beneath the same roof. That was home. And in that quiet, Ruth understood. Freedom isn't about leaving. It's about staying, holy and unafraid. Time would fade many things, gossip, loss, even the memories that once felt unbearable. But here, beneath this porch, with hands once trembling now steady in warmth, Ruth and Graham proved something simple and eternal. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts below. What keeps your hope alive, even after the storm? Like this story, to honor resilience and kindness. Subscribe to our channel for more Wild West love stories. Tales of quiet courage and blooming hearts beneath the wide frontier sky.